That passage, by the way, is in our hymn book as a reading. Wallace Beery did. Do I understand he was here at one point in this space? Yes. Great text. Tim Rosema, by the way, is a part of our larger Grand Rapids community. Was he not at the keyboard some weeks ago? Aren't we lucky? That's wonderful. I have a question to ask, but it's a rhetorical question. The question is, when did welfare become a dirty word? You know, I think I can date it to around the election of 1980 when Ronald Reagan campaigned partly on undoing the, so to speak, welfare state that was his designation for New Deal and Great Society programs. This was a calculated term on his part, as it evoked the colloquial meaning of welfare, the one we hear now, meaning an AFDC program, aids for families with dependent children, what used to be called the dole or being on relief. Ronald Reagan was fond, I think, of trotting out the anecdotal welfare queen in her Cadillac, the woman who had children just to get more money so she wouldn't have to work, an image that subtly evoked racism and sexism and classism without ever naming it that. Welfare became bad when it became a synonym for black unmarried women with children and unemployed boyfriends, even though most recipients of what is called welfare are white, and most of them are children. Among the 6 clauses of the preamble of the Constitution is the phrase, to promote the general welfare. This is one of the reasons for our government. It's the reason for the Constitution itself, along with those others like forming a more perfect union, establishing justice, and so on. And this is my 5th sermon, exploring what I call the national soul, which I point to as being in that document. I've turned the Lenten eye of inquiry on the country rather than on the individual. There are lots of issues out there as we listen to the campaign getting up, but no one is asking the larger question of what is the purpose of America? And contrasting the issues of the day with the preamble, I'm hoping to make you at least a little more willing to ask this larger question and not just decide which side you fall on the issues. Clearly, to me at least, the founders had a much more benevolent notion of welfare in mind when they wrote the Constitution. Before the 1970s, in fact, welfare was as benign as the word farewell, which is obviously the same word, just turned around, to seek good outcomes. That great Tory of English history, Benjamin Disraeli, of all people, said, "Power has only one duty, to secure the social welfare of the people." Mind you, he's a conservative. Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, of the folly called Alaska, remarked, "The Constitution devotes the national domain to union, justice, defense, welfare, and liberty." I could cite more, but you get the point. At least for a while, we used welfare to mean the common good, the thing that we all share, that we all need to have in order for all of us to be well. But what has been lost as we've turned welfare into a derogatory term for people who are poor and don't want to be responsible is that we have gone from thinking of welfare as a social good to thinking of it as a socialist evil. And in the meantime, we've lost the whole idea that there is a general welfare, that there is something we all have in common that we need to tend to. We have become an atomistic country where it's every man, woman, and child for him or herself, not looking out for number one, the devil take the hindmost, elbowing our way to the front of the line, making sure we get our share of the pie, get his share of the pie if we possibly can, and come out on top. Our best national leader, in my opinion at least, was that good Republican Abraham Lincoln, so wonderfully quoted by Dwight Eisenhower, when he said that the legitimate function of government is to do for individuals what they cannot do for themselves. And this seems to me to be a good description of what the general welfare is about. When I asked people through my weblog what issue they felt most strongly about, the most cited was health care. There's something that seems to come right up against that general welfare thing, doesn't it? And judging by the presidential campaign, it is now only exceeded by the impending recession And it outranks the two wars we're fighting, climate change and civil liberties, as being on people's minds, just judging by the amount of print that's being devoted to it. And it makes sense. Everyone has a stake in the healthcare delivery system. Your actual personal being. Those with, if you are sick or someone close to you is sick, it defines your life. Every day is affected by it. If you have a chronic condition like arthritis, if you're dealing with cancer, if you have a family member at home who is in some way compromised, at some level, every day is being devoted to some aspect of your physical well-being and the systems that exist to serve it. The worst part of aging, I am convinced, is not the getting old part, it's the getting old and worn out part. The loss of strength and ability, the increase in pain and malaise. I used to tell people when I was in my sardonic moments, that happens about once every 2 or 3 hours, that I don't understand when people who are old tell me they are lonesome, because even now when I get up in the morning, my body's yakking at me all the time. It's moaning and groaning, and it seems like I have no peace at all. But let's turn to the larger question. If we all have a stake in healthcare, to what extent does the state, the government, also have a stake? Does it even have one, really? Is it part of that mandate to promote the general welfare? And if it is, why is it? And if it's not, why is it not? The answer, is hard to figure out, judging by all the paper that you could read. And I'm not an investigative reporter. I'm not good at reading all the reports and all the different things that come out in the newspaper, just too much of it. And of course, if I then cited facts and figures, single payer this and competition that, eventually we'd be arguing about the facts and figures and not about the question. Should the state have a role in the healthcare system that we all take part in? I'm very fond, again in my sardonic mode, to remember what Mark Twain said. There are 3 things to be worried about in this world: lies, damned lies, and statistics. So we're going to stay away from facts so we can get to the truth. The question of whether government has a role to play is a moral question, not a practical question. How far it goes, that's a question I'll leave to the people who crunch the numbers. But let me figure out whether the government has a role to play. And I'll state right now, let me make my position clear, that I think that health care really does belong within that phrase, promote the general welfare. Because it does help us do for ourselves what we cannot do for ourselves. Because even if you're a physician, chances are if you need your appendix out, you're not going to lie down on a table and poke a knife in your own belly. Generally speaking, every one of us will need the health care system at some point, no matter how many vitamins you take, how many hours you spend at the gym, no matter how well you eat, no matter how good you are, you will at some point need a doctor, a nurse, a dentist, a hospital, and at that point, you cannot do that for yourselves. Of course, you should take some responsibility, but you can't take all of it, and that's where the rubber hits the road, doesn't it? To what extent should the state be involved? That's the dilemma. With all the attention being focused these days on insurance, insurability, on cost, on coverage, I want to come at this from a slightly different angle just to see if we can peer at it in a new way. I want to start in Rome, Italy. I want to start in the Forum. Have you been to the Forum? It's one of my favorite places on the planet. It's so magnificent because it's so old. And there's a hole in the street in what is called the Via Sacra. That's the sacred street. That's the one down which all the parades went. There's a hole there with a little railing around it. And inside the hole there's a sign, and it says in Italian and also in Latin, Cloaca Maxima. Anyone remember that? I do. You know what a cloaca is? Sewer. It means sewer. The city of Rome could not have existed unless they drained the marsh where the Forum now exists. It was a marsh full of mosquitoes, malaria, and of course where you threw your stuff out. They dug a sewer, put in pipes, terracotta, and eventually those awful lead pipes to drain the marsh, and so the city could be born. What has this to do with health care? It is the beginning of public health, which we all know about. Public health is really dull. It has no CT scanners, it has no interferon, it has no beeps and bumps, it has no Gregory House being weird and peculiar. It's about water filtration and fluoridation and vaccination and spraying for mosquitoes. What you may not know, some of you, is that it is so important that the 7th of our 7 uniformed services is the public health service. You may not realize that the Surgeon General has a uniform, and he is, or she is, an actual general. A general of the Public Health Service with quasi-military powers, going back to the time of Typhoid Mary and before. Anyone here remember the story of Typhoid Mary? An immigrant who was a carrier of typhoid who worked in a variety of restaurants and got all of New York quite sick. And so they used the power of the law to quarantine her. Public health has been in practice since the time of Rome. It shows up in the time in Europe in the Middle Ages, and it's clearly a part of our national role. So we have an interest in the public health. Clearly there's a long-standing role. We do not expect individuals like you and me to go out, dig a hole, and lay our own sewer pipe and make our own connection to the Grand River. We just won't let that happen. We do not expect you or me or anyone else to get out there every day and test the water with little strips to make sure it's still sound. We don't expect you or I or anyone else to check out to see if the medicine is pure or wholesome, or if the food is inspected, or whether or not the marshes have been sprayed for mosquitoes. Yeah, some of us could do that. But why would we? It'd be such a magnificent waste to have us all replicate all of those things. And of course, if we all had to do it, some of us wouldn't, and all it takes is one really mean mosquito. All it takes is one bad piece of meat to make everyone sick. So the stake in public health is huge, and therefore, because we can't do it, and because we all need it, the state must do it. And so your taxes make that happen. Government has a unique ability, and what I would say an inalienable responsibility, to ensure what is called the commons, the things that every one of us have to share because no one can take it away. Air, water, land, food, medicine, the things that we all need to stay alive. Well, how does this inform the debate around healthcare? Well, if the government should ensure that apples are safe, then shouldn't it also be ensuring that the insurance we buy does the job it's supposed to do? Setting standards. That's all I'm talking about, setting standards. Of course, that sounds like you're limiting free enterprise, and guess what? I am saying that. If you're an apple grower or a grocer or anyone else, it takes a little bit of extra money to clean the fruit and the vegetables before they get to your door. If you wanted to make the most amount of money, you would just pick them out of the ground and throw them in the truck and send them off and say, hey, wash it when you get home. And that's the way it was for a long time. But now we have laws that say, no, the food has to be edible, safe when it gets to you. Likewise with meat. Who remembers Upton Sinclair? Was it Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which shed light on the unregulated meat industry, which sadly seems to be coming back if you look at what's happening in Southern California, where they take cows that can't walk, which may be sick, and slaughter them and drag their bloody bodies across the floor and turn them into hamburger. Doesn't that sound tasty? But it's cheaper that way. So the government expresses its insistence that though it costs you more to make safe food, we are nonetheless going to require you to spend it because the public health, the general welfare, must not be compromised.